So, Mark, thanks for coming on and having the time to have a chat with me. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Greetings from Germany. I've been watching Tom's show for quite some time. I'm actually someone who pays him a few bucks so that I can finally talk to him. I've been following your show for maybe half a year or so. I found it because Bernardo Kastrup, I used to follow him a lot back then, still do. So you kind of find the interviews by title and so on. And yeah, ever since I've been watching your show, many of them are very interesting, and sometimes it's a little bit trash TV, it seems, but good nevertheless. So yeah, I just thought instead of having a real debate, which I'm not really so much up for, yeah, just ask you a few questions and you can share a little bit. Maybe we can talk about idealism also a little bit towards the end, but just, yeah.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yes, you know of David Chalmers, right?
Yep. The idealist guy, philosopher, who's a pretty well-known philosopher, very good and has a lot of good repertoire of academic published work.
Yes, I mean, to my knowledge, he hasn't never come out as an idealist. He has certain things that make idealists kind of jump on it, because he is basically saying that materialism doesn't really work. But in one of his papers, he said, he was actually talking about idealism in that very paper, that he doesn't think it's plausible, and he doesn't think that any of the other positions are plausible. So he basically says nothing is really plausible. All the positions just get a boost from the fact that something has to be true. So I was just wondering what you think about that.
I think that's a fantastic position. It's very much similar to mine. I think that we can never know anything with like metaphysical certainty. Like if you watch my original video on my epistemology, there's this class of knowledge called metaphysical knowledge, which is the fundamental nature of reality. And there's really no way to get to that. The only metaphysical knowledge we have is I think, therefore I am. I know I exist, so I know I am some part of this metaphysical nature, but we can know nothing more about it. Like maybe I'm material, maybe I'm dualistic, maybe I'm idealistic, who knows? And so I totally agree with that sentiment entirely. The one thing that I would note is that most philosophers, because they adopt fallibilism, they say that we can conclude things about the fundamental nature of reality. Even though we can't get there with that kind of metaphysical knowledge, we can still infer that based on our reliable methodologies, it's reasonable to make conclusions about that based on our reliable methodology. So for example, science works. Science seems to indicate materialism, therefore it's reasonable to conclude materialism based on like an inductive kind of a measure, even though we can't actually get any kind of metaphysical knowledge. So I totally agree with that as well. I think that it's reasonable to make conclusions like there's probably material is the only thing there is, because that's the only thing we have reason to believe for now. But we can't make any types of absolute conclusions about that fundamental nature of reality, because we don't have any access to it other than just the cogito.
Mm-hmm. So what I was wondering, a few times I've noticed when people start attacking the materialist position, you always make, I don't know if I should call it a move, but you're dodging it a little bit. You're saying basically it's not going to do you any good attacking materialism. You have to defend idealism or whatever spiritual belief you're holding on its own grounds. I was wondering if maybe not right now, but maybe later in the discussion we can change that a little bit and talk a little bit about the weaker points of materialism.
Well, just to clarify, I think that it depends on the context. Like if someone is defending idealism or something, they can't just attack materialism. It doesn't matter. Even if materialism is false, that doesn't support idealism. So it's the same kind of a thing of the creationist versus evolution debate. Even if evolution is wrong, that doesn't support creationism. You have to supply evidence for your hypothesis, not just try to defeat opposing hypotheses. So that's usually the context of when I say that it doesn't matter if you're attacking materialism. It's mostly about you have a positive claim, you need to support that positive claim. But I totally think if you're just saying, I think materialism is wrong, then it's perfectly reasonable just to attack materialism if that's the proposition you're defending. That's perfectly fine.
I mean, many philosophers believe that that's all we have. You have ontologies, and all you can do is kind of hope for a last man standing approach. Analyze them for coherence, what makes sense. But I think that since you, I believe, are a materialist, you may not share this belief. You may just say, no, it works a different way. So I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's not.
What do you think about thinking and analyzing in general?
Well, thinking and analyzing is good. That's all philosophy is. It's, but like I said in a previous chat, Philosophy is science's drunk uncle, so it's not nearly as important as science. But to your earlier point, it's not the last man standing approach isn't correct. It's more the one that works the best. So like if you want to know if a hammer works, you pick it up and use it. And that's the test to see if the hammer works. And that's not most people confuse this with circular reasoning and say, well, you're using the hammer to justify the hammer. Like, no, we're using the hammer to show that the hammer works. And that's not the same as circular reasoning. And the same applies to our different methodologies. So we can test things based off of our methodology and see which methodology works the best. So I can say, I'm a materialist. I create this kind of scientific methodology. And if it works, that's good evidence of my hypothesis of materialism. And then you're an idealist. You can come up with an idealist hypothesis or idealist methodology, and we can apply that and see which one of ours works the best, and then just infer from those methodologies. Whichever methodology works the best, we're just going to conclude that the ontology is like that, even though we have no access to ontology. So it's not a last man standing approach. The criticisms don't matter. No one cares about the criticisms. All that matters is the functionality of the theory. So for example, if I had a hypothesis of a round square, and the round square hypothesis worked and gave us testable predictions consistently much better than anything else, then we'd all just have to like throw our hands up in the air like, yep, round squares exist. Who cares if it's logically contradictory? Like the problems with it, the coherence doesn't matter. If it works, and it wins. So it's not really the last man standing approach because our internal critiques don't make a difference if it works in reality.
But this is actually an impression I got once or twice in the past. You seem to still somehow believe that you can put an ontology hypothetically into some sort of science experiment. Can you prove an ontology with science?
No, it's like I said earlier, it's you can use methodologies, and if whichever methodology works the best, you can then just make a conclusion about ontology based off of the methodology. So if you have a materialist who's made this methodology called science and it works really well, then you can just jump to the conclusion, yep, we're material, we're done. So it's about the methodology, not the ontology. If the methodology works and it made a hypothesis about the ontology, then we can just concede that it's probably right until we have a better methodology. So it's not saying anything about the ontologies. I had this conversation with the Majesty of Reason yesterday.
That was awesome, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really great conversation. And we went over the same point. Like, even though you can't differentiate between the ontology in and of itself, you can differentiate between the methodologies. When whichever methodology works better, it's reasonable to conclude whatever ontology it infers based off that methodology, even though it can't test the ontology directly.
What do you mean right now with methodology? Just a little example.
Just any kind of method. Like I can shake a magic 8-ball and the magic 8-ball tells me what the lottery numbers are. That would be a methodology. Like any kind of method that you use to infer facts or knowledge about reality. So science is a methodology, divine command theory is a methodology, reading the Bible is a methodology. Just any kind of method that you can use to infer knowledge about the world is a methodology. And then how successful it is the measure of how good the methodology is. And the best methodology is the one we can infer. This is the one that's probably correct about ontology as well, because it's the best information we have right now.
I have a different question. I want to come back to this later, because this is something that maybe you are just more knowledgeable about. It seems that some physicists, and maybe you can tell me which ones they are in a broader context, leave the door open to the possibility that the universe is infinite. And then that seems to contradict the Big Bang idea. So I'm just very simple. I don't have a lot of knowledge about these things, but the universe could be infinite. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, there's two things there. Like every physicist says the universe is infinite in the future. So like the Big Bang happened and then space is infinite in all possible directions from that point in the future. And then in the past, it's most physicists think it's past eternal infinite also, which means there is something natural prior to the Big Bang, and that existed infinitely, essentially eternally into the past. And that's the consensus in physics. Like, for example, William Lane Craig Sean Carroll in his debate with William Lane Craig gave 30 examples of models of physics that all had a past eternal infinite. So just rejecting his infinite regression paradox hypothesis. Like no physicist cares about Pruss's arguments that there can't be an infinite past. No one cares. In physics, the consensus is yes, it is past eternal, and every physicist thinks it's future eternal.
So they also do it's past eternal?
Yes.
Okay. That's a possibility. Is that the majority believing that?
Yes, the vast majority of physicists believe that it is a past eternal of some kind. That is pretty much all of the models, like I mentioned. Sean Carroll just listed 30 with a 30-second Google search that all say it's a past eternal. So the vast majority reject Pruss's argument that there can't be an infinite past. No one in physics really concedes that.
Okay. I remember a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, a friend of mine sent me. Now I don't believe in any deities or religions, but he's a Christian, and he sent me this video. It was a documentary, a little bit of everything. The Four Horsemen, I think they're called, right? Dawkins, Harris, and then and all the other stuff. And then at the end,
all the other stuff. Dawkins, Harris, Dennett, and Hitchens.
Yeah, exactly. And then Christopher Hitchens was asked, I think, what is the best argument that you ever encountered from the other side? He was in a cab. I don't know if you ever saw that.
Yeah, that documentary is actually him and Douglas something. And him wrote a book together. They did a debate format book, and they went on several tours and debated in public, having this conversation. And that was a conversation with him and Douglas something, I forgot his last name, talking about this. Yeah, I totally remember. I know exactly what you're talking about. And he said it was the fine-tuning argument.
Exactly. And then he was like, it makes you wonder. And then there was this really dramatic music, and the movie was over. So same question to you. Is there anything that ever made you wonder?
Yeah, like in my conversation yesterday with Majesty of Reason, the best argument is the argument from necessity. There has to be something in reality. Like you mentioned earlier, philosophers all agree that there has to be something, and so Chalmers specifically says there has to be something, so that lends credence to every possible hypothesis. There's got to be something. And so that same kind of a thing, the necessity argument that there has to necessarily be something that existed, there could never have been an absolute philosophical nothing, means there is a necessary being in that kind of a sense. What any properties about that are completely unknown. I'm totally happy with it being an infinite regression. There's no problem with that. But there definitely has to be some necessary thing that has always existed. And so in that case, that argument that theists use, the contingency argument, is actually the best argument they have, in my view. I'm not really that impressed by the teleological argument because it has fairly obvious counters to it, like which we went over in the same conversation yesterday.
Are you a materialist who would bet his right hand on materialism being correct, or is your motivation for doing this show that maybe you are, I don't know if annoyed is the right word, that other people think their own arguments are conclusive and you just want to prove them? No, it's not that conclusive. Is it epistemol? What's the word there? Is this about epistemology? I think you've written a book on it, right?
Yeah, so my book is about my epistemology and how I ground knowledge. So mostly my channel is about showing that the theistic arguments are bunk. They're all complete garbage, and you can prove them all false. That's really the point of my epistemology. It's just to show, to be able to identify bad arguments and bad evidence when it doesn't actually indicate the conclusion you're trying to espouse. It isn't actually promoting an ontology. So I'm not promoting that materialism. Materialism is just the most reasonable inference based off of the evidence. So I'm a methodological naturalist. I don't usually conclude there is no supernatural. I just conclude that right now it's only reasonable to believe in the material because that's all we have evidence for. So I wouldn't bet my right hand materialism is true because I don't think that we know all that much about the universe. I would agree with Thomas Edison that we only know 1/1,000,000 of 1% of anything. So I'd say there could absolutely be other things out there that would be non-material or non-natural in some sense that we just haven't discovered yet. Absolutely, that's a possibility, but we have no reason right now to believe it. So I usually don't make any claims about ontology beyond just materialism is the most reasonable inference right now. And the more important discussion is about epistemology. What grounds our claims of knowledge? And that's my focus. Not really, the ontology thing really doesn't make a difference all that much.
Mm-hmm. I think you said also in the past that you used to believe in God when you were earlier, right?
Yes.
When you were younger.
Yeah, I used to believe in God up until I was about 17 or 18.
And you're now?
What? Now I'm 32.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then what stops just, learning about science, having aha moments and so
on? What stops learning about science? What do you mean?
Yeah, what changed your belief? I mean, it's natural.
Oh, yeah, my belief had nothing to do with the arguments or the evidence. It was purely based on emotional reasons. So I was praying to God every day because I had major depression my whole life. And No, none of my prayers were ever answered. None of my situation ever improved. And so it stopped being possible for me to believe there was an all good, all powerful being who really cared about me up there, who would just watch my suffering and let it happen and never do anything to change it. So that eventually caused me to stop being able to believe there was such a being. And that was what caused me to stop being a Christian or to believe in God at all.
Mm. Um, I think after you talked to Bernardo Castro back then, you talked to somebody else. I don't know. It was maybe a fan of his or something, a younger guy, and you said, I don't know. I think in order for idealism to be true, there would have to be something idealistic in it, in the universe. That is. I was wondering back then what you meant by that.
I have no idea. I would have to look back at the context to actually understand that.
Okay,
So,
but so you don't necessarily identify with that statement.
well, I have no idea what the context was or what it means just hearing it right now. But I think that, like, yeah, again, for idealism to be true, there has to be some kind of like consciousness thing that exists in the universe for sure. Like, if there is no fundamental consciousness thing and it's just an emergent property of material processes, then idealism would not be true. It would just be epiphenomenon. So that, in that sense, which I think is probably what I meant, is that you need a consciousness to exist as some kind of ontology independent of an emergent property. That's probably what I meant. So yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
Right, but idealism means that that consciousness is all there is. There's nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
That means it is something. The universe. There's some sort of a feeling. It feels to be the universe.
Right. So that would be the thing, is there needs to be this consciousness thing which has its own ontology that exists. That's the argument that I'm saying is not the case. It's more likely consciousness is an emergent property of physical things, not that consciousness is an independent thing that exists in the universe. So obviously you could have dualism where you have consciousness is an independent thing that has its own ontology and materialism has its independent thing that has its own ontology. Or you have idealism where it's just consciousness is the only independent ontology. Either of those are fine, but you still need consciousness to have its own independent ontology for either one of those to be true. And if it doesn't, if it is just an emergent property, then they're both false and materialism is true.
Yes, obviously, but if so let me ask you: this universe that we live in, could idealism be true? Could it be true?
Well, anything could be possible. There could be pink unicorns jumping on my butt if it's possible, but there's no reason to believe it. So I would say that the reasonable conclusion is no, it is not the case.
It's one inference. I mean, you've heard this one before, but it's one inference. It's just could be.
Yeah, anything could be. Like I said, literally, anything that isn't a logically impossible is by definition possible. So anything other than square circles is possible. So there could be pink bunnies on Mars. I could be the president of the United States. I could have billions of dollars in my bank account right now. Those are all possibilities. But unless there's evidence to support it, it's reasonable to conclude that that's just an imaginary hypothesis that has no basis in reality. And I'd say the same about idealism.
I agree, of course, that it's an imaginary hypothesis. I think it's just not comparable to pink unicorns. Just like if you said there's a bubble in my, when I cook something, it's reasonable to assume that outside the water bubble there is a water bath. So it's a little bit more simple, don't you think?
No, that's kind of the comparison I like to make. Is the same thing with a god and idealism. I think it is more like the pink unicorns dancing on Mars. If there's no reason to believe it, just the fact that you can make it fit all past evidence gives us no reason to believe it at all. So it's reasonable to conclude that because all of our examples of consciousness seem to be a product of a brain, that consciousness is a product of a brain and nothing else. Until we find some kind of other basis for consciousness, then it's reasonable to conclude consciousness is just purely material, just like it's reasonable to conclude all spaghetti is made of pasta, essentially, or physical things. It'd be unreasonable to justify the conclusion there's some kind of essence of spaghetti that created the universe, like the flying spaghetti monster, because all of our examples of spaghetti are things that are material, things that have a basis in wheat of some kind. The same thing applies to the mind. All of our examples of a mind are material. They have a basis in a brain. And so it's just as unreasonable to conclude that the universe was made by a spaghetti monster as it is to conclude the universe was made by a anthropocentric human monster. It's just as ridiculous. So just like it would sound ridiculous to a theist to say, the flying spaghetti monster created the universe, that's equally as ridiculous as it sounds to an atheist to say a god created the universe.
Okay. So I don't know about you. I think most idealists, they don't just fall from the sky, right? It's impossible. I mean, you go to school, you're not an idealist, nobody is. And then so suddenly there's this tiny percentage of idealists, very, very small. And I think one of the reasons why it's so small is simply because nobody really cares about metaphysics. Maybe us who care about it, we have a different impression, but nobody really cares about metaphysics. For me, someone who believes in the Bible he's not interested in metaphysics, you know. Very few people are interested in this topic. That's what I'm noticing. So I think that's the reason why there's such a small percentage. But what I'm saying is the reason why they become idealists, or at least non-materialists, is because it occurs to them that materialism doesn't work. Now, you disagree, of course, but what would be a weakness of materialism, if anything?
Well, to address your first point, like there's many metaphysicians, like there is an interest in it. Like it's obviously a minority in philosophy, but there is many metaphysicians, and most of them are materialists. So it's not just the fact that there's few people who have interest in metaphysics and those few become idealists. That's just not the case. Most people, right? So most people who do have an interest in metaphysics are still materialists. They still conclude materialism is true. The reason there's so few idealists is because all of the arguments are against it. All the evidence is against it. It isn't supported by anything. And that's why most people don't go to idealism. The one reason that it seems like most people become idealists is because it gives an importance to consciousness, and people value consciousness, which gives an emotional connection, leading to those kinds of ideas that consciousness is fundamental. But it's not really based on the evidence or the arguments for the most part. It's really based on just this feeling that, well, I have consciousness. Well, if consciousness is fundamental, that could explain something of the universe and make it significant in that way. But the weakness of materialism, I don't know exactly how to answer that question. It's mostly like kind of like David Chalmers, there's no ontology that gives us answers to everything. So there's always going to be factors that materialism doesn't answer, but nothing answers them. So it's not really a weakness of materialism. It's just materialists usually just admit we don't know. And so if they admit we don't know, that seems like a weakness, and other people come in and try to fill the gaps of knowledge and say, well, I can answer that question with this ontology. But really, all of those things that materialists say we don't know to could also be answered by just more material things we just add in and make up. So all of the weaknesses of materialism are essentially God of the gaps arguments from ignorance, where you say, here is something we can't explain materially, therefore some non-material thing, but we could just add in, here is something we can't explain materially, we'll just add in a new unknown material thing. So I don't think there's any real weaknesses to materialism in that way. It seems to have no more weaknesses than any other ontology. The only difference is that they don't pretend to make stuff up and add in things that aren't based on the evidence. That would be the weakness that they have. They don't go beyond the evidence.
But are you saying that you are not aware with why some people believe that materialism doesn't work?
No, I am aware. I just think they're using arguments from ignorance. So I'm aware that why people believe in a God in many cases, like, oh, well, how did God create the fine tuning? Yeah, it's just, well, that's just a basic God of the gaps fallacy. You can't understand how it happened, therefore you infer this other thing that seems intuitively obvious, but that isn't actually evidence for your conclusion. So I understand why people are idealists, just like I understand why people are theists, or why they think God is a good solution to these arguments, but it's just false. Their arguments do not work. That's the problem. Their arguments do not provide evidence to their conclusion. It's just a thing we don't have an answer to. They can't imagine natural solving it, so they imagine something else solving it. And I can just say I can imagine natural solving it, which disproves their argument.
Okay, so you're saying materialism is true until proven otherwise.
No, I'm saying we have evidence of materialism. We have no evidence of anything else. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude materialism until proven otherwise.
True. But then if idealism was true, for example, the only way to figure that out is to literally be the universe. There's nothing else.
No. So it's, again, we're not talking about ontology here. The ontology doesn't matter. Like, obviously, we won't be able to tell the ontology of materialism or idealism either way, unless, like you said, unless we were omniscient or we were the universe. But we can tell the methodology. So if the idealists all got together and built their own methodology of science or whatever, and we implemented that methodology and it worked better than any of the materialist methodologies, then that would be good evidence of idealism. So you don't need to show the ontology of idealism. You just need to create a methodology based off of the ideology or the idealist ideology. And if that methodology works better than the materialist ideology, that would be evidence of idealism.
An idealist would certainly say that there's not even a question about these things, because materialism, it basically just crumbles to nothing within 5 minutes of thinking about it. It's impossible. So an idealism would say matter doesn't exist. It's all consciousness. And then you can make it work. It's a model, it's a conjecture, certainly, but then again, so is materialism.
Sure.
So why would anyone become an idealist until they had serious reasons to doubt materialism first? I mean, you were making some claims, we want to give meaning to the world and all that stuff, emotional reasons for becoming an idealist. I don't think that's the case. I mean, it would be an add-on if the universe was kind of meaningful or whatever. But
Just to clarify, what I mean is that all ideas in human heads, all decisions we make are emotional. They're based on emotional reasons. Like if the emotional centers of the brain get damaged, you're unable to make any kind of reason or inference at all, because the way the human brain works is based on emotion. So there's an emotional connection to consciousness, and saying, well, if consciousness is fundamental, that is one of the different hypotheses, instead of saying matter is fundamental. It's again just an emotional connection that you're making to make any ideas. So I didn't mean like literally you're adding value to the universe. It's just the way we come up with ideas is based off emotional biases in the brain, and that's just true for everybody. But there isn't actually any evidential reason to come to idealism. It's just an emotional inference that consciousness is fundamental, and there isn't anything to support that.
Okay. Yeah, that's odd. But then again, it has been like that for hundreds of years. I mean, both parties think, how can I make you understand? Yeah, because I think once you really, how deeply have you thought about different ontologies, not necessarily just these two, but whatever else there is, panpsychism, simulation theory, what else there, cosmopsychism. How do you go about these things? Do you ever meditate and contemplate, or it's just science?
Mostly I just go with it's science, because everything starts as imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. So all of the ontologies, panpsychism, panentheism, panendeism, whatever you want, polytheism, omnism, transtheism, henotheism, whatever you want. You can add in whatever ontologies you want. They all start as, here is something in my head, and it's only an idea with no basis in reality until demonstrated otherwise. And so that's the way I start about ontologies. I could be a bird in the vat. Okay. Is there any reason to think that's true outside of my imagination? No. Okay, so it's probably not the case. So that's how I start with ontologies. Like, well, you have to give a reason to believe it's true outside of your imagination. Until you can, it's just imaginary.
But don't a lot of scientific endeavors start out like this, with ideas in our heads, and then we kind of go on a journey, and then we see, well, maybe we can do an experiment. And I guess we don't always find experiments, because if we did, we would already have all the answers that we are looking for, right? But there's nothing wrong with having an idea in your head. You just have to see where it leads you, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a difference between a hypothesis and an actual evidential demonstration that your hypothesis corresponds to reality. So it's totally fine to come up with a hypothesis that the universe is idealistic. That's perfectly reasonable. But if you actually want to hold the position the universe is in fact idealistic, or we are in fact a brain in the vat, you would need some evidence to support that, not just the hypothesis in your imagination. So I'm perfectly fine with people coming up with hypotheses based off of whatever they want. You can just like shake a can of Cheerios and just scry them on the ground, and then you're like, oh, it says that the universe is made of pink bunnies. That's perfectly fine as a hypothesis, but that hypothesis is equally supported as the one that we are an idealist one, until you can give some kind of external verification that corresponds to reality and isn't just an idea in your head. So I'm totally fine with using ideas to come up with hypotheses, but hypotheses don't count as evidence that the hypothesis is true. For that, you need some kind of external basis to confirm it's not just an idea in your head.
Also, I think that even in Bernardo's Google group, I've never seen anyone who says, I know this for 100% fact. Nobody knows these things. But based on coherence, it makes a lot of sense. And materialism, yeah, so let's address that. Doesn't seem to make any sense at all, because it applies. For example, what do you think is, where you're looking at me right now, what is there really?
Brain?
where you're seeing this Mark Tetzner guy. What is there really?
Just a brain and chemical interactions, nothing more.
What?
Brains and chemical interactions, neuroplasticity of the neurons. There's an electrical signal between the different chemicals in the brain, and that causes consciousness.
But under materialism, none of these things are really there. They're just in your head. Whatever you see, whatever you think about a chemical reaction, or whatever you may observe under a microscope, whatever you see is in you.
Yeah, that's all a product of the chemical. So literally, the chemical interaction is the consciousness. Those are synonymous.
Okay, so what about what about this? What about so you think that consciousness is an emergent property of matter, right?
Yep.
But what is matter? I mean, what is matter?
Fluctuations in fields of energy.
Okay. But under materialism, isn't it true that all this energy and chemical reactions is only math, basically?
No, the math represents physical things.
The math represents the description of physical things, right?
No, the math is the description, but it describes actual physical things. So, like a proton is a physical thing. An electrons, gluons, Higgs fields, those are all physical things. Space-time is a physical thing that exists. It's not math. Math is just a language like English to describe it. So the mathematical equation for space-time, the lambda signal in general and special relativity, is just like saying space-time. So lambda and space-time are literally the same thing. They're just words that we made up to describe the physical thing that actually exists, like the word tree.
But what other attributes does this pen have in reality onto itself once you take the mathematical description away?
Well, that's like asking, what are the descriptions of the property of the pen if you don't have English? Like, how am I supposed to give you descriptions of properties if I don't have English to do it? Like, I need some way to describe the properties. So math is, again, just the description of the properties. It's just a language. But if I can't use language to describe properties, then I guess I'd be like grunts and like, it's like,
Yeah. But that's exactly the question. Where are the properties? So let me just let's just make this easier. An idealist would say that this thing only has properties because it really has properties. It really has them. It has qualities of consciousness, right? So under idealism, there's only consciousness. So this would be, this thing has qualia, this thing. Okay, so the qualities of consciousness are not in your head. They're everywhere.
Right, I think that's called confusing the map and the territory fallacy. So the qualia is your representation of the thing. Like if I come up with a word tree, the word tree does not exist anywhere in a tree. It's a word that we made up in English. There's no such thing as a tree. Tree is an English word. And there were many words before the English tree that described trees without the English word tree. Math is the same thing. The pen existed before math existed. The math is just a language we made up to describe the pen. The pen existed before humans existed, so the consciousness of humans to recognize the pen is irrelevant to the existence of the pen. The same thing applies to everything in the universe. It seems like all things in our world existed prior to any humans or any consciousness. Like conscious things seems to have been around for maybe 2 billion years or something like that. There's the first conscious thing that has a brain of some kind. Before that, there was 11 billion years of no consciousness in just a matter-based universe, it seems like. So it seems perfectly reasonable to think all those things exist with no consciousness whatsoever.
Yes, but when you're saying that this pen is just the representation of the pen in our heads, let's say, then automatically it means where the pen really is under materialism, there's literally nothing.
I don't know what you mean. Like if all humans died, the pen would still be there. The pen is still there, but our idea of the pen would go away. So I think you're confusing our idea of the pen with the pen, which is again confusing.
No, because every attribute and everything that you can assign to this pen, except for the math, I don't know, the dimensions, the way the molecules and atoms move around, that would be the only thing that is still there, because everything else is just in your head.
Yeah, that's the pen. The pen is just the atoms and the molecules moving around. That's the pen. Our descriptions of the pen wouldn't exist, but our descriptions don't matter to the pen. So all that would exist is just the matter moving around. That's all the pen is.
But in the materialism, so I think that's this word game. There is no matter that is doing the moving around. There is only the moving around.
No, in physics, the matter is real. The matter is a real thing.
So you're saying a materialist would say this thing has attributes outside of the things that the matter does.
I don't know what that means. So it has attributes. Like all particles actually exist. Particles are real, and there are collections of particles, and we label those collections of particles. The collections of particles are real. All of the particles are real. The collection is real. It's not a fake thing that only exists in human imagination. The label only exists in human imagination, but the collection of particles is a collection of particles. Like the sun is the sun and the moon is the moon. They're not the same thing, and they exist perfectly fine without human beings labeling them. They're just different collections of particles.
But under materialism, there is only the momentum and the speed and all these things. You know, all the things that can be represented as a physical formula.
Mass, like mass.
And nothing else. The rest is in our heads, in our perception.
Like mass. So like mass is the object exists and it deforms space-time. So there is a something there that deforms space-time that gives it mass. That is a physical thing. That's all it requires is mass. If it has mass, it's an object that exists with no mind.
But even mass is a measurement, right? Or the result of a measurement?
No. Mass is something we describe. It is a physical deformation of space-time. It's not a measurement. It's literally it is the thing that deforms space-time. It's like it is a physical object that causes a dimple in space-time. It's not a measurement. It's not an inference. It's literal physical interaction in the universe.
Yeah, no problem with it. It's behavior of stuff, the way we perceive it.
No, not the way we perceive it, the way it actually is. So it is ontologically there. It ontologically bends space-time. Our perception of it doesn't matter because it was doing it way before we perceived it.
But what is the stuff that is hiding between the behavior of the stuff, whatever that may be?
The stuff that's hiding between the behavior of the stuff.
Not hiding, but there has to be something substantial. The stuff that you call stuff. I call this stuff because it's a pen. It looks a certain way. It has a color. It's shiny. It weighs something. That's what makes it a pen to me. But all these attributes are obviously not there when I'm not around.
Right. Your perception of the attributes isn't there. Like yellow isn't there when you're not there because yellow is a subjective thing based on how the eyes receive light and process it in the brain. But the reflection of certain wavelengths of light is still there. Like it's there whether you're there or not. The fact that these collections of particles reflect photons at a certain magnitude is a factual thing that occurs with no consciousness. That's not just a property humans attribute to it. That's a factual thing that happens regardless of consciousness. We just label that as yellow.
Yes, but what a materialist is saying that outside of our bodily boundaries, there's literally nothing. There's only some sort of shadow.
No materialist says that. No one says, I'm a materialist. I do not say that. So there's not materialism.
Does the world have attributes or potential attributes?
I don't. Attributes are things that we attribute to the world. Like, does the world have properties? Yes.
Let's distinguish.
So the world has properties. So matter has properties. Yes, matter is a physical thing. It has mass. Mass deforms space-time. It has properties.
Okay. Okay, can you give me a few more properties that matter has?
Spin, momentum, speed, energy, mass. Those would be the main ones.
Mm-hmm. So you know that the question is now, how do you turn these into consciousness?
Yes, it's an emergent property. The same way you turn them into stars. Like a star is a collection of hydrogen and helium that has built enough of a mass to collapse in on itself and deform space-time to cause a certain kind of fission nuclear reaction. So if you have enough of the just hydrogen and helium and they come together, then a second force that wasn't affecting them before, called gravity, will cause a new emergent property to occur, which is a fusion nuclear reaction, which only occurs because the force of gravity has enough of an influence on it to change its nature that it didn't, to add a new property it didn't have before. So the same thing happens to consciousness. So if you add a bunch of material things into a chemical soup of the earth and it develops into a living organism like a bacteria or whatever, and that bacteria grows into certain kinds of other cells which are a result of evolution in DNA, then those certain other cells have new functions based off of their new genetic code, then they have an emergent property called the brain, which is what produces consciousness. Just like there's an emergent property of the sun produced by gravity when there's enough helium and hydrogen atoms that come together to cause the new force to have a emergent property that it didn't have before. So yes, combinations of things that have no consciousness can come together and have an emergent property of consciousness, just like helium and hydrogen atoms, which have no property of fission, can come together and produce a thing that has the property of fission.
So this is really the only question I have. Is there any part of you that thinks, I'm saying this because it is just my belief, or what makes you so sure? Because it's so bizarre.
Well, I mean, everything everyone says is because it's a part of their belief, unless they're lying or something. But I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, I think with Bernardo Kastrup, you had the same problem. It was about the bricks and the brick wall, and then you said it's what's this fallacy called, the decomposition fallacy or whatever?
Yeah, composition division fallacy. None of the whole doesn't have any of the parts, therefore the parts can't have any property, or the parts don't have a certain property, therefore the whole can't have a certain property. It's just common emergence. Like you can have a bunch of parts, none of them have a property, and then if you put the parts together, they have a new property. It's just called emergence. So yes, it's a composition division fallacy to say that because that consciousness can't come from non-consciousness, or life can't come from non-life, or walls can't come from non-walls, or suns can't come from non-suns. They're all just composition division fallacies. You can obviously get new properties based off of accommodations of things where none of those things actually have that property to begin with.
Well, if you want to stay in materialism, you have to deny that consciousness is something of a new kind, correct?
Well, it's a new kind of
Compared to a dead universe where there's only math.
Well, I'd say that in materialism, you have to deny that consciousness is its own kind of thing that exists independently of other emergent properties. So you'd have to say that in materialism, that consciousness is a product of other non-conscious things. Whereas in idealism or dualism, you have to say consciousness is not a product of other things. It has its own ontology.
Right. So is it the same as how would you phrase it? Is it the same as matter, or is it just like you build a wall from bricks? It's just kind of, I don't know. It's just an extra attribute, or what is it if it's not something new?
Yeah, it's just a pattern in matter. So like, for example, you can have an electrical pattern in matter, and you can have a heat-based pattern in matter. So it's not electrical. Or you could have a water-based pattern in matter, or you could have a carbon-based pattern in matter. All matter can have different patterns that occur, and they're based off of different orientations of the matter. And one of those orientations is consciousness, and another orientation is a star, and another orientation is a computer. So it's just a different orientation of matter that produces a different result. So just like you can have a computer that produces electrical signals, you can have a water hose that produces a fountain, and that's just a different combination of matter. And that's consciousness is just the same thing. It's just a different orientation of matter that has a different emergent property. Just like an orientation of bricks produces a wall, an orientation of hydrogen atoms produces a sun, an orientation of hydrogen and oxygen atoms produces an ocean. It's just a different orientation of matter.
I find this odd because all these things that you're talking about, they're one category. And then there's one category that is different, that is us observing all these things, thinking about all these things, talking about all these things, having a concept of heat, feeling heat, talking about it. It seems so different, but to you, it's just all the same.
Yeah, it's just a different orientation. So like, for example, you could say there's a fingernail clippers. Fingernail clippers is a different orientation. It's got the fingernail clipper orientation, and everything about this orientation is unique to this fingernail clipper orientation. Like, that doesn't mean the fingernail clipper orientation is somehow a new ontology. It's just a different orientation of other things that already exist. So obviously there's many unique things about every single orientation. Like, the orientation of this fingernail clippers is unique to any other combination of fingernail clippers or any other thing in the universe, because this is the only one that exists in exactly this location. Therefore, this fingernail clippers is perfectly unique and must therefore be completely separate from any other orientation of fingernail clippers. But that doesn't mean it has its own ontology. It's just a different combinations of things that of the same kind of ontology. So consciousness is the same. Just because it has its own unique individuality to it, just like these fingernail clippers do, it does not mean it's a new ontology. It's just a different combination of other things that already exist.
Yes, a materialist believes by necessity that everything is some sort of arrangement of matter, and that's it, right?
Yes, or energy, but yes.
Okay. So, so the idea that everything could be in mind and consciousness, I'm just asking because a few weeks back you said that idealism is actually a joke position. So, at the very least, can we agree that it's as coherent as it gets? Is there anything in the empirical world that contradicts the conjecture of idealism?
I don't know what you mean by those two questions. So, is there anything that contradicts it? No, there's also nothing that contradicts pink bunnies on Mars, but I'd say pink bunnies on Mars are equally as coherent as idealism. So, there's nothing that contradicts it. I don't think it's a square circle, but the fact that every example of consciousness we have is purely material, concluding that consciousness is itself a non-material thing is just like concluding there are pink bunnies on Mars. Like every example of bunny we have is not pink, and they are not on Mars. Therefore, to conclude there are pink bunnies on Mars is equally as reasonable to conclude consciousness is non-material. If inductively, if all of the examples we have indicate otherwise, it's reasonable to conclude it is not the case that it's somehow a new ontology.
Okay, so just to keep it a little bit shorter, idealists could kind of make the same case, and at the end, materialism would look like nonsense and would be comparable to pink elephants on Mars. What would you do? Huh?
How so? Like idealists could make the same case. Like how could idealists make the same case?
Yeah, similar case. It doesn't make any sense to think that outside of myself there's nothing.
No materialist says that. So
all the attributes that I'm assigning to you because I'm perceiving them, right? Materialism, they are only in my head. They're not where they are.
So yeah, materialists don't believe that. So that's just a straw man of materialism. Materialism thinks
no. I think okay.
Materialists think that there are actual properties that actually exist independent of consciousness and always have. So there is a real you, but there's different ways to describe that you. Like I can describe you in collections of labels in English. I can describe you in Japanese or German or binary or whatever, but our labels don't matter. But there are actual properties there, which are the things in space-time. The mass, the spin, the energy, all of those things describe a collection of material particles that actually exist, that actually has a certain kind of configuration to it, which actually produces consciousness. All of those are real things independent of mind. None of mind has any relevance to those properties. They all exist independent of mind. So no materialist thinks that there is nothing outside of mind. They think that everything is outside of mind, and mind is just a collection of descriptions of those things that already exist.
Yeah, I think that's where we really disagree. I think that we are not strawmanning materialism. I think that most materialists, they think like idealists. They are idealists, but they're labeling themselves materialists. Because what you just said is a perfect example of it. You said, I forgot the precise words, you said that the things out there, they do have certain attributes or something. That's exactly what I said half an hour ago. They have qualities of consciousness because consciousness is what they are.
Right. So I'm a materialist. I can tell you you're absolutely strawmanning materialism. Like you may talk to others and they may agree with you, but I don't. And no materialist I've ever spoken to would agree with anything you said there. So the fact that there are things like there is a thing has mass. Mass is something we made. Mass is a label that only exists in the human mind. It never existed before the human mind. But the fact that it physically deforms space-time, that always existed before mind. There was no mind there when things deformed space-time. So the property of mass, which it has, is a label we made up, but that label describes an actual thing which we did not make up, that existed independent of minds. So you're confusing the map, our labels and our attributes. Our attributes are things that we label, that are the labels we've made up to describe features. The features exist independent of minds, always. They're always describing something out there, or it's just not a part of materialism.
So what I'm saying is an idealist would be the last person on earth to deny that everything happens, first of all, in our mind. Now, the idealist, of course, goes farther because he thinks that the entire universe is in mind. But other than that, exactly what you just said, it all happens in our mind. We label it. Everything happens from
right,
our
and that's
position.
materialists saying no. Materialism saying not everything happens in our mind. The only things that happen in our mind are different categories of labeling, but the labeling doesn't matter because the labeling is just describing things that already exist, the things that happen outside of our mind, that don't happen in our mind, that happen in no mind.
I think you are speaking like an idealist.
You can think that, I guess.
Under materialism, okay, so you are at least rejecting the idea that under materialism, this thing is only and exclusively the equivalent of a physical equation.
Yeah, the equation is just a words. So like saying a tree is only equivalent to the word tree in English, like is obviously wrong. Like the tree exists independent of the English word. Math is just a language. It is just like English. There's no difference. It's just a word game and nothing more. So like math has description, like the way to describe English is that there's sentences that correspond to reality, there's sentences that do not correspond to reality, and there's sentences that are self-contradictory. So for example, that is a tree would correspond to reality, that is a Klingon like from Star Trek would not correspond to reality, and that is a married bachelor would be self-contradictory. So you have sentences that can describe reality, sentences that don't describe reality, and sentences that are self-contradictory. Math has the exact same thing. 1 + 1 = 2 is a sentence that describes reality. F equals ma times 47 is a sentence that does not describe reality. And then 1 + 1 = 7 would be a self-contradictory sentence. So math is just a language to describe things. Nothing is math. Math does not exist anywhere. Nothing has the properties of math. Math doesn't give any properties. It's just a description. There's nothing in math. Math doesn't exist. So things are not mathematical descriptions. That is not the case. Mathematical descriptions describe things.
Okay, so again, that nail clipper in your hand, does that have any attributes outside of math without a human observer being present?
All attributes exist outside of math. Math gives no attributes ever. There is no attribute of math. Math is not a thing. It doesn't exist. It's just a language. So all attributes exist outside of math.
Okay, but if this thing flies through the air, then we can still measure it, and the pen still does what it does, right?
Yes.
There's a pen flying through, yeah, and
sure.
that can be expressed in math, and whatever that is really exists.
We can describe it with English too, but the math and the English don't exist. They're just languages. So if we can say, if you throw a pen through the air, I can say, oh, look, the pen is flying through the air. I can describe it with English, but the attributes don't come from the English. Like the English doesn't give it an attribute. It's flying through the air on its own without the English there. So math doesn't exist. Nothing in math exists. Nothing in language exists. They're all just made up conventions in the human mind to describe things that exist.
But how would you then really explain in 2 sentences, elevator pitch, what materialism is?
Matter in motion, that there is stuff that exists and it moves.
I find that kind of odd.
Okay, why would you find that odd?
Because my understanding of materialism is that only the things, the behavior, basically, the momentum, the speed, the charge, the geometrical arrangement is real, and everything else is something, of course, on the screen of perception. So that is exclusively in the brain. So there's basically 2 completely different worlds, which is exactly why, back to the beginning of this conversation, Chalmers said that materialism and consciousness are incommensurable, which is what idealists agree to, and why they're idealists. What do these things have to do with each other except nothing?
So again, I think you're confusing the map and the territory. That seems to be the common fallacy when you say like matter. Materialists agree that it's just matter and spin and mass and energy. That's all. Those are the only real properties. Everything else is a property we label. So like pin, there is no property of pin. Pin is not a property in the universe. It's a label we apply to the pin. Yellow is not a property in the universe. Yellow is a label we apply to a certain frequency of light and how our brain translates that. So the only real properties are mass, energy, spin, charm, whatever, all of the different qualities of particles. Those are the only real properties. There are no other real properties. They're just those. And then we label certain collections of those with new properties. So like the sun. The sun is a collection of things being affected by the strong and weak nuclear force to produce hydrogen and helium, which is based on bosons and gluons that hold them together. And those things are affected by gravity in such a way to produce fission of the result. But all of those things are just different forms of spin, mass, energy. There's no additional property of sun in there. That's all just a label. There's no additional property of fission in there. That's just a label of how they interact. There's no additional properties in there. It's just the material things. So I think you're confusing our labels as actually existing in the world, which they don't. Obviously, our label of pin does not exist in the pin anywhere.
That's true. But does that mean, let's say, imagine an ocean wave. The ocean wave has all kinds of wetness, for example, how cold it is and what it feels like, what it looks like. That doesn't exist in the real world, or does it?
Does what exist?
That it's wet, that it looks shiny,
no!
That it makes a sound. The way it looks, everything about it. Is that out there in the real world, or is that just our labels?
Those are just our labels. So like cold is a label that we use based to describe an interaction between our like the neurons in our hand touching something else that can absorb heat, the heat in our hand. So the only thing that's there
by the way it looks, it sounds, the texture, or whatever you want to call water.
Those would be the same as touch. So it's like touch is when we touch something and we feel it. It is our brain interpreting the transition of heat between our hand and the object, because the speed of the electrons going around our hand slows or are faster than the speed of the electrons going around the water, and the change in speed in our hand causes our brain to feel this. Light is the same thing. It's our brain feeling the difference in the vibration, the frequency of light. So that's all it is our brain having these chemical reactions that produce these sensations and how it interprets those actual properties in the world. So it interacts with actual properties in the world and then creates fake properties in our head to describe those actual properties in the world. But the fake properties in our head don't exist. Those are just the map. The territory actually exists. So our consciousness is like a language. It doesn't exist. There isn't an actual tree there. It's not a pretty tree. It's not a beautiful tree. It's not a slow tree. Like those are all things that our brain makes up like a language to describe the things that actually exist. So everything in our conscious experience is a made up representation of what actually exists.
That is true. But then I wonder why it's so difficult to at least entertain the idea that there is stuff that there has to be some sort of substance to the stuff outside, to the tree. There has to be something, and that it gets translated to something that we see on our screen of perception. But on the materialism, all these things that you just said, the coldness, the this and the that, once you subtract all that, there's just nothing left.
Yes.
What is
when I'm sleeping, then I don't see anything. But whether I see things doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So again, it's still confusing the map and the territory.
You said yourself, it's the chemicals doing this and that.
Yes.
So what is going on with this water wave when you're sleeping?
The physical spin, mass, and energy are being transitioned to other locations.
Okay. And from that kind of stuff, you can also create a human being with consciousness.
Yes. You just have to, it's just different in orientation of those things interacting.
But how does David Chalmers say these things just don't fit together at all? Is he just a simpleton? I mean, they don't seem to make any sense together.
Seems to make perfect sense to me. There's nothing about that doesn't make sense. I don't know why David Chalmers doesn't think it makes sense. I'd love to talk with him about it sometime. I'll send him another email. I've sent him a few to try and get him on, but he hasn't agreed to. But I don't know what his position is. But it makes perfect sense to me. I don't see any issues there.
Yeah. By the way, I'm not saying he's this or that. My impression is he's kind of having a neutral position. But he said, of course, that spin, momentum, speed, and all this stuff, if that's what the world is like, you cannot bridge to consciousness at all. There's just no way.
Yeah, I just say that's a basic composition division fallacy. So I'd say that it's obviously, you can't say that some combination of those things couldn't produce an emergent property that has a new thing that those things don't have. It just doesn't make any sense. Like, obviously, combinations of things can produce new properties all the time. It's emergence. It's literally everything in the world around us is just an emergent property.
And then materialism, if the world just consists of speed, momentum, charge, what justifies calling these things things or stuff? For example, I listened to a podcast between Philip Goff and Sean Carroll once, and then Sean Carroll said they were having the same problem there. Said, well, there's stuff, and there's stuff, the thing stuff does, and that's all there's to it. That's what I believe Sean Carroll said.
Yeah.
And then I'm asking myself, what stuff are you talking about? If all this stuff is what stuff does, then what is this stuff?
So, like, if you have,
would say you cannot separate the spin and the top. They're one and the same thing. The top is, or the pen is here, and the moving is what it does. You cannot separate them and say that all there really is the behavior of something, and the attributes of the pen are only in my head. That's the typical thing that materialists believe, that idealists think are a little bit, yeah.
I'm not sure I'm following there. So, for example, if we have three particles, there's one particle here, and there's two particles here, and they're both conjoined together. There are two objects there. There's two particles that are conjoined because they share electrons, and there's one particle that doesn't share electrons, and those are two different things. And then you can change them and take one particle from here and move it, and then attach it to this particle, and then there's two separate things. So you can definitely say there are three particles here. They are independent things, and they are different from what they are doing, because what they are doing can change while what they are can stay the same. So it's pretty easy to differentiate the object from the doing, because the object can do different things while being the same thing. So obviously the object and the doing are not the same thing.
But all these things, all these attributes, every single attribute this pen has, except for things that can be expressed in mathematical and physical equations, under materialism, are just somehow generated by the brain.
No, the math is exactly like any other description. So math and yellow are the same thing. There's no difference there.
Yes, you know the difference between perceiving yellow and some math equation expressing yellow.
No, I mean the English word yellow and the mathematical description of the frequency of light are the same thing. They're just made up languages. The word yellow and the math for yellow are the same thing. They're just descriptions.
Yes, but not the perception of yellow.
Right. The perception of yellow is an emergent property in our brain. But that doesn't change, so that the math and the English both describe a thing that is independent of our brain entirely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thanks, Tom. What I would maybe like to do is, I don't know, take this video, and if you want to post it, that would be good. And maybe I can, we can talk again someday in the future, and maybe I can bring someone on who's been doing idealism for even longer, because I think, well, first of all, I don't like to be confrontational. It was to be expected that it's always kind of the same, always will be. And that's kind of it. And maybe we can, I don't know, challenge you a little bit more in the future.
Sure. If you can get Philip Goff, that'd be great. I'd love to chat with him sometime.
Who?
Philip Goff, the guy you were talking about earlier.
I don't know him personally, but if you, Bernardo Kastrup's Google group, have you ever been there?
Mm-mm.
So they debated the other day. Did you see that?
Mm-mm. I have not seen it.
It was actually a heated debate with a few scathing articles, a lot of back and forth. So Philip Goff and Bernardo Kastrup had a panpsychist versus idealist kind of thing going on, and it was quite funny. It was
Definitely
good. It was entertaining.
Well, anyway, it was great talking with you. It was a lot of fun. I don't think we weren't too confrontational. Like, there's definitely, I've had confrontational things like with Dark Dawkins, but
I just don't. I never like to be confrontational. I think materialism is the only thing in my life that I've thought about for years. To me, I know that it's nonsense, but it's always interesting because idealists, and I know this sounds condescending, but it's not meant to be. But they often think that materialists fall into the otherwise intelligent people camp. You're a very smart guy. Your processor is fast. I know that. So it's fascinating to talk to a specimen like you. That's pretty much it.
All right. Yeah, it was great talking with you. I'll talk with you later sometime.
Yeah, we'll do that. Thank you.
Bye.